So as we move into these last chapters, we're dealing with what I've considered to be exploring the details. Pretty much by the end of chapter 5, Solomon has concluded his discussion on the big issue of how to understand the eternity of things from the beginning to the end. And then we've been looking now at just some things that he is going to fill in, and a lot of it has to do with more traditional type of wisdom literature, but still with this undercurrent, this back theme of, but it's not always happening in a way that Proverbs seems it would. So just an overview here of chapters 6 to 8, that they form a rather long section in Solomon's exploration of life in his quest to find a way to fully understand why God does this or that in ways that often don't make sense to us. And there are tons of those things, aren't there? The search for this comprehensive understanding is frustrated by wide-ranging enigmas involving incongruities and reversals in real-life situations. And nevertheless, he determines and advises, life can still be lived profitably, even joyfully. And so that's what we're working at. We have looked at chapter 6, which sets forth the fact that a satisfying life experience is not guaranteed to the one who is financially well off, because God may not empower him to enjoy those material benefits. And we looked at that great incongruity. The first 9 verses, wealth doesn't automatically benefit its possessors because it's not received in the right attitude. And then that chapter concludes by noting that only God fully understands what a person is, and therefore how best for that person to live and how foolish to contend with him. At the end of that section, a question is asked: who knows what is good for man, and who can tell a man what will happen after him? And chapter 7 actually picks up that question and actually deals with that in the sections. So 7, it doesn't matter how life is lived. The most important thing is character. Right living requires a serious approach, not a fun-seeking perspective. We saw that the wise person will take care not to let any prosperity, adversity, tensions corrupt that character. That wisdom always gives the advantage in living life to the best and fullest, even though the person does not understand God's arrangement of things. Then he moves on in verse 15, a problematic centerpiece of this divine arrangement of things involves the righteous and the wicked getting what the other really deserves. And that really is kind of the undercurrent through this whole part of the book. It says these reversals are kept in perspective by trusting God in the face of this apparent contradiction, armed with the resolve to pursue wise living. However, that wisdom cannot do, or what wisdom cannot do, is explain the origin of folly. That's what we looked at last week, which accounts for mankind's disregard for God's original designs for life and for living. So that's the end of the review, and now we're going to move on to looking at what else is going on here. So in chapter 8 in verse 1, it starts out with a question: who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. Only the wise, and the way I'd summarize this, only the wise can properly evaluate life's dilemmas and respond positively to the outcomes. This is really an introduction to how to live under various authorities. What we're going to find a lot in here is about the bad king, the good king, and so forth, and just some very practical advice as how to live in the midst of these enigmas where there just seems to be an overturning of justice or an overturning of the right rule and the responsibilities of authority and so forth. The word interpretation here is the word that's used in Daniel 5, where it talks about his ability to interpret dreams. So it's the ability to come up with a sense, and the thing is, we always like that. We always are seeking for an understanding of things, how to interpret this situation, not just languages, but interpret life, interpret what's going on, and that really is at the heart of what Solomon is working at. And so that's the questions that's asked. And then once a person does come to that, wisdom makes his face shine. It's not going to be getting the answers. You're always happy when we're working on a problem and we get the answer. Oh, there it is. That's what I was looking for. Well, Solomon doesn't get that answer with his problem, but he says there's still a way for your face to shine. It's through wisdom. So we're going to see throughout this whole section is emphasis on wisdom, classical statements of wisdom that fit with the book of Proverbs, but with the little caveat thrown in, but there's an undercurrent here that just might not seem to go along with how God wants you to act. So wisdom puts a shine on the face when the circumstances seem to dictate otherwise. Verses 2 to 8, he's going to make the point that successful living under the rule of a tyrant requires wisdom in differentiating between duly constituted authority and self-serving whim. You ever run into that situation? It might be just a supervisor, it might be a president of a company, it might be a governor, it might be a president, it might be whatever. You think, well, yeah, I like this, but this really grates me. So, I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you bring that together? And that's what his discussion is about here. And so it's as practical as life in any context, all through time. So he starts out here in verse 2. I say, keep the king's command because of the oath to God. Now, I have mouth here after command. What we're going to find is he uses 3 different words to talk about directives or suggestions or some kind of communication from the king, and I'll explain what's going on. But it literally says the king's mouth. It's a metaphor, and I think it's what it's doing here is emphasizing more the person who wields authority, not so much what's being said, but here's a person who is saying something that I'm going to have to deal with respect to what to do, how to respond, how to act. So it emphasizes the person who wields authority rather than the position itself. And then it says, do this because of the oath to God. And I think this is another way of talking about the fear of the Lord. That's the reason to obey tyrants. And this concept of the fear of the Lord was introduced clear back in chapter 3. We saw it in 5 and 7. And we're going to see it again in chapter 8. So I'm just going to reference that to the oath. I think that's the same idea behind here. We serve and obey the authorities over us for the biggest reason because that's what God says we're to do. He says, children, obey your parents. He doesn't say obey your parents when they're right, when they're perfect, when you agree with them, when you can't find any fault with it. Obey your parents. Now, there are times when you don't obey your parents, and that's covered in the Bible too. So it's the same thing going on in this passage, in this discussion. He says, don't be hasty to go out of his presence, that is the king's presence. So there's, the temptation is, just let me out of here. Okay, you expect this, just let me live my own life. He says, don't back off just because there's issues, okay? Don't take that approach to authority. And that's the easiest thing to do sometimes, isn't it? You can either go get your pitchfork and fight, or you could just flee, just leave. And the Bible says neither one of those are how to live under authorities from the standpoint of what God expects. So basically the idea in verse 3, the first part is support an authority's good rule. And then it says, don't persist in an evil thing. Many interpreters take this as saying, don't rebel against him. But others don't take it that way. And I think in this context, as I've looked at it, what it's saying is, do what the king says, unless he's telling you to do something evil. Now, the Bible does, I think, make clear that that's, John and Peter and John, when they were brought before Sanhedrin for preaching Christ, they told to stop. And they said, we can't stop, for God's command. So there's a time to disobey. And I think that's what he's saying here. So don't be hasty to try to get out from under authority. The authority's going to tell you a lot of stuff that's for your own good. There's no problem obeying it from God's standpoint. But if he asks you to do something evil, yeah, that's where you draw the line. So this is just really practical advice with regard to how to live under authorities. And you will find that from most every authority. There's a mixture of sane and insane, maybe good and bad, of righteousness and evil. Righteousness in the sense of, I'm asking you to do things that even God wants you to do, though He was not saying that. And yet I might also ask you to do things that are evil. So there's still the capacity here for moral choice, but basically he's saying that authorities are there and they need to be submitted to in the proper way, or resisted at the right time. Verse 4, he says, "For the king's word," and here he uses a different word. It's speech. So now it's actually the speaking, and so it uses that word, "is supreme, and who can say to him, what are you doing?" And the point here is just that autocratic rule preempts reasonable resistance. So here in this context, it's not talking about an elected official who you can, replace in an election and recall and so forth. He's talking about people who are there, and they're there and they are the power until they're gone for whatever reason. So it's a different context than what we live in a democratic society or a representative form of government. But the point he's making is just very, very common sense. When he says something, be careful. Be careful, okay? Who can say to him, "What are you doing?" Yeah, be careful when you bring into question an absolute ruler, a tyrant, okay? So again, just common sense with regard to living in this kind of a situation. So that's the flavor of this whole section. There are things about God's rule that just don't make sense, and boy, some really big illustrations of that in the realm of human authority. But there's still a way to live wisely in that context, in that whole dynamic where you've got the negative and positive currents going on. Verse 5, he says, "Whoever keeps the commandment shall not come to harm, and his wise heart will know the time and the procedure or judgment." So 3 different words here used for communication: the mouth, the person it comes from; the speech, just whatever utterance. This word is the word that's used of God giving the commandments. And so these are these look more at the proper function of governing. Rules, commandments, regulations that are set forth for the governing of people. And observing them will generally be a positive thing. Okay? So tyrants usually don't ensconce their, is that the right word? Their evilness in laws. They make the laws positive and good. See, I'm a good king. These are good laws. Okay, fine. Even though on the side, just unrighteous tyrant and just, taking people advantage of things. And you find that in governments all around the world. The most tyrannical governments probably have a book full of laws for their populace. They're positive that, you could apply just about any culture. Now, that doesn't mean that's all that's going on with regard to the rule. So you can see here how this is just a very balanced consideration, and Solomon, as a wise king and as somebody who has general wisdom, is just saying, okay, this is a difficult situation, and I want to give you some practical wisdom, some practical advice on how to live in that situation. And then he says here in verse 6, "For there is a time and procedure or judgment for every purpose, although the misery of man is heavy on him." And so I think what he's saying here in the last part of 5, his wise heart will know the time and procedure, and then verse 6, they must be carried out thoughtfully. In other words, with wisdom, even though it may be in a troublesome situation. So it's not going to be easy. You don't just wave a magic wand. Okay, I'm going to be wise in response to this king who says some reasonable things and some unreasonable things. It's going to take some thought. It's going to take some figuring out, and you're going to be in troublesome situations. And so it's just a real, live, practical, common sense approach to situations that are found all through history at all forms and levels of government. Now, this kind of runs on the thought into verse 7. He says, "For he doesn't know that which will be, for who can tell him how it will be. Now what that verse 7 means against the two verses just before it, whoever keeps the command shall not come to harm, and his wise heart will know the time and procedure, generally. For there's a time and procedure for everything, although trouble, or the trouble of man, is heavy on him. So the situation is, there's just a situation here that troubles me. And if I say the wrong thing, bad things are going to happen. So I think that's this flavor of this atmosphere in this statement. And then so he concludes, for he doesn't know that which will be, for who can tell how it will be. I think what he means here is that the timing of actions requiring justice should not be calculated against the trouble. Okay? Okay, my boss comes to me and he wants me to do something that really isn't kosher. I know it's not the company policies. I know it's not really what our vendors or customers or whatever. What do I do? What do I do? Okay? So how do you respond? I think what he's saying here is, well, don't respond in order to minimize the trouble. Don't respond with, okay, what's the least problem out here? How can I wield this? How can I manipulate this situation? That's not wisdom. Well, the wisdom is, what God's want me to do. You know, what do Proverbs tell me about honesty and so forth? Graciousness, yeah, and so you see here. So it's not to be calculated against the trouble, but simply on the basis of what is the right or the just thing to do. And if you are a person of wisdom, if you have memorized the book of Proverbs and you've worked at applying all those various different general principles and specific commands, you pretty much come to have a sense, okay, here's what I should do in this situation. And I know it's going to cause grief, but that's not my first priority. My first priority is, how do I fear God? How do I reverence Him in my response? And if He gets me in trouble, if it gets my supervisor in trouble, that's his problem, not my problem. Okay, and so again, just a very practical approach to living in governments. So going on in verse 8, there is no man who has power over the Spirit to contain the Spirit, neither does he have, or is there power over death, or overpowering in the day of death. I'll explain that. And there's no discharge in war. What he's giving here is three impossible situations, okay? And he's saying, you get yourself in impossible situations, and you can't solve the impossible situation by applying the problem to the problem. Okay? I don't know if that makes sense. So, given the impossibility of restraining the wind by means of the wind. Okay? Boy, the wind's blowing this way. Let's get a big fan and blow it this way and get the wind to change directions. Okay, so obviously that makes sense to us. The next one is a little more difficult. It's usually translated, you don't have power over death. We say, well, yeah, I can decide when I end my life. But that's not what's going on here. The way it's stated is, gaining power in the day of death. Okay, I need the power. I need to overcome something, and the only way I can think of it is through death. Well, once you die, do you have any power? No. Okay, so you see it just doesn't make sense. All right, that's the kind of thing that he's saying here. He's just giving illustrations of impossible things, or discharging from the battle in the day of battle. Now, if you're in the day of battle, you can't be discharged because you're in battle. Once you discharge, there's no day of battle. So you can't have both being discharged and being in the day of battle, the one overcoming the other. So obviously he's just saying, here's some impossible things. And in the same way, so wickedness cannot deliver those who practice it. Okay? So if the king is asking you to do something wrong, you don't do something wrong to solve that wrong. Now, can that happen? Can we? Yeah, we can get ourselves in that situation. So this word wickedness always includes the idea of evil intent and injustice against God or persons, negative behavior of evil thoughts, words, deeds that are contrary to God's character. So basically he's saying, when you find yourself in a problem, when you find yourself in a situation, a situation where you're being asked to do evil, you're being asked to cooperate with wickedness. If you do that, or if you do something in the same category to deal with that, you're not doing what God wants. You're not. You may solve a problem in the short term, okay, but in the long term, that's not wise living. And so he's just very, very practically here talking about these real life situations where we can get ourselves into trouble with regard to responding to authority. It could be a parent to a child. I've often used the illustration of a young person who becomes a Christian, starts going to church and starts learning what it really is to live righteously and, as pleases God. Then he comes home and the dad says, I want you to go do this. And it involves breaking a law, violating a moral code that God has. And so there's the child, and what do I do? Just get my dad off my back and do what he says and know that it's wrong, and God, just no. He's supposed to act as a God-fearer. And so how do you do that? So there's just all kinds of practical situations where this is applicable. Okay, well, the next verses, 9 to 14, he's going to come up with an even more problematic case when abusive tyrants are getting away with it and create further wickedness down the line. So verse 9 says, all this I have seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There's a time in which one man has power over another to his hurt, that is, to the person who's under the power. So we're just, it's just another more serious case, intentional harm done by an authority, okay? Not just unintentional because, hey, I'm the bad guy and you're just getting caught in my vortex of evil. He goes on, so I saw the wicked buried, and this is talking about the one who has the power over. Indeed, they came also from holiness, or from the holy place. Now, the idea there is he's in worshiping, okay? So he's being religious. And there were some evil kings in Israel who would go and, have sacrifices, but they're just bad kings. So, that happens. They went and were probably not forgotten. There's some textual issues here, and I'm not sure what all, but I think probably they were boasted about. In other words, people approved of him. Oh, he's a wonderful ruler. They knew about it, okay? Do we run into those kinds of people? Sure, all around the world. And sometimes it's publicized. And so you've got these wicked, evil people, and they're just fawned over, okay? And that happens. In the city where they did this also is vaporous, just extremely difficult to get a hold of. So there's two examples here of wrong. In verse 10, the wicked who boast piety are approved by others, and they live long lives. Now, there's one wrong, but it's not the wrong I'm thinking of, and he's not brought into justice, okay? So this is vaporous, it's inexplicable from the standpoint of what is expected according to Proverbs. And so we see harm here in two ways. First of all, the one who is hurt by this tyrant who's getting away with his false piety, he's harmed, okay? And so, he's not brought to justice and he's allowed to harm other people. And again, we see that all the time in large and small scales. But then also, it says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. So if wicked people who are harming others were brought to justice, that would end their immediate wickedness. Can't do anything about what they've already done, but you could stop them from doing more. Is there an argument for capital punishment? Well, that is one. They won't kill again, okay? Now, the issue is bigger than that, but that's just a plain truth. So the harm is twofold, the one who's hurt, and then the delayed harm, the absence of judgment, which again can be in terms of harm directly by those who are not judged. So they go on and they harm others. So that's a consequence. Or people are emboldened to the same kind of a life. Well, I can play church. I can look good and do whatever I want. My leader is, okay? So what he's saying here, there's just multiple levels of harm that go on in that kind of a situation. And so it's the way life really works. Now it goes on here in verse 12. Though a sinner commits crimes 100 times and lives long, yet surely I know that it will be better with those who fear God, who are reverent before Him. Now I've got those words. What you have here is an adjective. It would be better for fearers of God, who fear Him. There's the verb. In other words, true believers who are living like true believers. So wise counsel here, despite this reversal of long life for the wicked replacing swift justice, it's still beneficial to live responsibly in respect to God's awesomeness. That's the rule of life. What pleases God? What's of God's character? And if I'm a God-fearer, if I have attached myself to Him in belief, I want to live that belief. And I think the two words here, one is an adjective, one is a verb, are getting at that. Okay? And so we may fear God and yet be tempted not to obey Him, not to respect His awesomeness in a specific given situation. He goes on in verse 13, but it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he lengthen days like a shadow, because he doesn't fear God. Now this whole thing of lengthening like a shadow is just, I can't really grasp that. The Net Bible says this, I think is interesting. It says, unlike a shadow that lengthens at sunset, the wicked do not normally live long. So it's talking something about the lengthening of a shadow. And it's, in the evening, it's not like the sun comes over the tree and the shadow's there and it's just gone. The shadow gets longer and longer and longer and longer. You say, well, the day's going to end, that shadow's going to disappear. It's not ended yet, so the shadow gets longer and longer. That makes sense with regard to sometimes these wicked rulers just prolong their life, and it goes on and on and on and on, and everybody wishes it would end, but it doesn't. So that's the scenario he's setting up here. And so then in verse 14 he says, there's a vanity, a vaporous thing, which is done on the earth, that there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. And I said, this is just vaporous. This is just impossible to get a hold of. And so this is the summary about reversals. This enigma of the righteous and the wicked getting each other's due might appear to be some sort of suspension of the laws of moral universe, God's moral universe, a conclusion that Solomon rejects, okay? So it seems like, there's just no rule here. God's the God of the universe, and He's a righteous and good God. And so, how do you account for all of these things? And that brings us to the fifth refrain of the book. We've looked at this in summary form earlier, where he says, then I commended joy, because a man has no better thing under the sun than to eat and drink and to be joyful. For that will accompany or stand by him in his labor all the days of his life, which God has given him under the sun. This is the last of the formulaic refrain patterns. Nothing better than to eat and drink, okay? It'll occur in parts, but this is kind of the end of it, and we see that we're coming to a conclusion of one part of his discussion. And then the addition of I commend to the nothing better than. That's something new. So it's getting a little more forceful. And then later on, he's just going to command, go and eat. And we've already begun to look at that, I believe. And then with the encouraging promise, we'll stand by him. So this really comes to really the conclusion in chapter 8 of these, looking at the details with regard to how to live under this scheme of things. And at this point in the book, it brings us to a session that we've already looked at, the conclusion of the matter, getting ready for the final exam. Now, I did this earlier to jump over all this material we're just almost finished covering, to kind of give an overview of the whole book, okay? And hopefully that helped. And I'll review it here just very, very quickly. So this is the failed task that Solomon's at work at. This is what accounts for all the negativity, the frustration, the statements that sound like they might be coming from a secular hedonist, but they aren't. He's trying to grasp the providential workings of God. And so that's the difficulty. In his conclusion about man's present state in 9:1-6, and we've already looked at this, so we're going to review this really quickly. I laid my heart to explain this, and the righteous, the wise, their deeds, they're in the hand of God. But then he says, there's one event that comes to all things, one event. And of course that event was death. Death is inevitable. And he goes on, and this is that interesting thing we looked at. For to him who is joined with all the living, there's hope, for a living dog's better than a dead lion. Okay? And the point is not the value of dogs and lions. The point is, it's only the living who are granted the potential of living life joyfully and glorifying God in the process. So we've looked at that as part of the conclusion, and this really formula is the conclusion of the book with regard to, here's my overall practical advice for living in this world that can be so frustratingly complex with regard to these issues of God's providence. He goes on in verses 7-12, go your way, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a good heart, for God has already accepted your works. And he applies that personally, let your garments be white. He applies it relationally with regard to beholding life in its fullness with your wife in these fleeting days. And he applies it occupationally, whatever your hand finds to do it. And so we see that very positive advice in this very complex situation. And then he concludes chapter 9 with this, and we looked at this. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Now, is that an absolute statement? No. And he's made it clear that's not an absolute statement. From the standpoint of computing God's providential workings, that's a true statement, because this does not happen all the time. So the preceding advice should now be followed, and that is, even though unforeseen reversals are sure to arise, here's some instruction in wise living, even though reversals may be encountered along the way. And that's what will continue in 9:13. And so that's what we're going to look at next. So we just covered chapter 8, now we're going to cover chapter 9. This whole section, 9:13 to 11:8, we won't get through 11 today, I'll save that for next week, but we'll get through 9 and 10, the end of 9 and 10. In light of the unpredictable future and the inevitable perplexing reversals concerning the wicked and the righteous, Solomon concludes with a variety of illustrations on lessons on wise versus foolish living. So that's what we find here in this section. First of all, on wisdom spurned. He gives this little scenario. I've seen wisdom under the sun in this way, and it seemed great to me. There was a little city and a few men within it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, and built great bulwarks against it. Now a poor wise man was found in it, and he by his wisdom delivered the city, yet no man remembered the same poor man. Then I said, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. So again, just another truism, another situation. So this is an example about the irrationality of wisdom not being valued over foolishness. How many people do you know that really value wisdom? Do you know people that really value foolishness? Yeah, it's easier to fall into that, isn't it? And so that's what Solomon is working against here. So he says, this seemed great to me. What he's saying is a really great illustration. I didn't have to go look at my illustration file for this. I had it right there, or somebody else's illustration file. Verses 14 to 15, a poor wise man thwarted a great king, but no one took notice, and he was never memorialized. Okay? How rude. Okay? And Nevertheless, he says, wisdom is still to be valued above mere strength, since wisdom can take a person or a city beyond normal human capabilities. Now, we just have to take that by faith. There are illustrations of it all through history. There are illustrations of it in the Bible. There are illustrations of it in our own lives. And so, again, here's an illustration, and just take this to heart. You know, no matter how bad it looks, wisdom is still there, and you can do unbelievable things just by applying the wisdom of God in His strength and His power and unto His honor. He goes on in verses 17 to 10:1. Wisdom spurned is a stinky thing. The words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the cry of him who rules among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. And dead flies cause the oil of the perfumer to send forth an evil odor. So does a little folly outweigh wisdom and honor. So just a little statement similar to what you'd find in Proverbs. So we see a little foolishness can spoil great wisdom, and it's not hard to notice it. You know, when you're walking the house and something smells, oh, what's that, Jay? God's resources, wisdom, are better than the best of human abilities, shouting among fools. So all the advice that does not come from God is like shouting among fools. And so it's an interesting comparison. In verse 18, wisdom is better than weapons of war. Wisdom results in the construction of a positive life experience, whereas the ways of the sinner destroy the best in life. And so just very practical reminders of what wisdom is. 10:1 about the dead fly. A small corrupting agent spoils a large pleasant thing. Okay? It doesn't take much to spoil something, does it? One little germ, okay? And there goes that whatever, you were saving for lunch or supper or whatever. A small misstep in living life can ruin the influence of a life that otherwise is lived wisely. So he's not talking to people who aren't wise. He's talking to people who are wise. And be careful. One of the interesting things about the book of Proverbs, there's an image in the book of Proverbs that's kind of stated in so many words in some passages about walking on a path on the side of a hill, okay, steep side of a hill, and it's the path of wisdom, all right. And the point is that a fool never falls into wisdom. You purposely, intentionally develop it by faith. That's the whole appeal to the simpleton, the naive, the young person who's at that crossroads of emerging into adulthood and making decisions that are going to be life-changing. You have to commit yourself to it and learn it, and you have to stay on the path. But it's easy to fall off the path. Okay? And sometimes you can fall to where there's no recovery. Okay? Now Solomon, later in his life, is going to learn this, isn't he? Okay? So so that's that's the point here, is that don't dabble with foolishness thinking, well, I'm wise, I can handle it, or it's just a little thing. No, there's danger here. And we find this throughout the book of Proverbs. Okay, into chapter 10. Chapter 10, verses 2 to 7. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart is at his left. And we're just a general truth here. The function of wisdom is to direct a person's capacity for thought, emotion, decision making. Now you've got a whole thing of right and left here, and it's not having to do with political parties. It's not having. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor, and talks about God's right hand, God's righteous right hand. I think it's just because for most people the right hand is dominant. And so it's the hand that's most useful. It's the hand that you would extend in honor and so forth. And so that's all it is in terms of probably just the dominance of right-handedness. But it is used in the Scriptures consistently as a metaphor for favor, strength, protection, and not from person to person, but even from God to human beings, metaphorically in that regard. It says in verse 3, yes, also when the fool walks by the way, his understanding fails him, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. It's just evident in everyday life, okay? You can't hide foolishness. You can make yourself sound not foolish, but you can't really hide it. Verse 4, don't forsake the way and resources of wisdom just because a ruler opposes you. It says, if the spirit of the ruler rises up against you, don't leave your place, for gentleness lays great offenses to rest. You don't know when your gentle spirit and wisdom might overcome that harsh, unreasonable tyrant. You don't know. But it doesn't matter if it does or doesn't. There's still the right thing to do. There's the right way to approach that situation and that person. And then in verse 5, there's an evil which I've seen under the sun, the sort of error which proceeds from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, and the rich sit in a low place. I've seen servants on horses and princes walking like servants on the earth. So because rulers all too often walk in the way of the fool. And so just again, don't be deterred when you find foolishness in high places, and you will. You will find it. Don't be surprised. It's going to happen. It's going to be there. Now he goes on in verses 8 to 11 of chapter 10. Wisdom always works toward success. He who digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall may be bitten by a snake. Whoever carves out stones may be injured by them. Whoever splits wood may be endangered thereby. If the axe is blunt and one doesn't sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But skill, and here it uses a good word, good English translation, but it is the word hokmah, which is the word for wisdom, and that's one of the basic meanings. A skill in something brings success. If the snake bites before it's charmed, then there's no profit for the charmer's images. Several little images again which illustrate wisdom. And the summary is, sure, bad things happen, but wisdom minimizes the risks and guides the effort. So these are normal dangers, these activities from everyday activities that might bring certain risks. I mean, just walking out the front door is a risk, okay? So you're going to live life and you're going to have those risks. Such risks are chance because these activities are necessary in day-to-day living, okay? Just common sense. Verse 10, the wise person does what is possible to minimize the risks because wisdom works towards success. I have spent quite a bit of time behind a chainsaw and an axe, mostly a chainsaw when we were heating our house with wood in the northern climes, okay? And there's nothing worse than a dull chain on a chainsaw, and it's dangerous because you start using it like a hacksaw rather than a chainsaw. And so you keep your implements sharp. That's the safest way. Oh, if they're sharp, you might cut yourself. No, if they're not sharp, you might bang yourself in the head, cut your leg off, whatever, okay? Just common sense. And anybody who uses those kinds of things knows that. I was once watching a man butcher a cow, and I was going to say in the back of my office, and it literally was, but there was an empty store in between, and he used the far back, and he would do butchering for farmers who'd bring a cow in. So I was watching him, and he had it strung up. This is going to sound kind of gross. And he was skinning it. I don't know if you ever watched that. But he didn't spend more than 15, 20 seconds before he'd sharpen his knife, skin a little more, sharpen his knife. I mean, it wasn't, I'm going to sharpen this when I get home. It was sharpening between so many slices and cuts in that butchering process. And that's what it's talking about. Wisdom takes some time to apply, but it's the safest, wisest way to live life. And then finally in verse 11, even poor timing can rob of success. So it's not what do I do, but when do I do it? Okay? And so wisdom just, it covers all the bases and it just instructs how to approach life in a way that will be the most successful in its outcome. So the summary here, Proverbs says, wisdom brings success to the degree that the desired outcome depends upon our choices and actions. And we see that in these verses. But Ecclesiastes and Job say, true, but absolute success is never guaranteed in day-to-day living. So if you keep those two things in mind, as you read a book like Ecclesiastes, as you read Job, that solves the tension. That solves the tension problems. There are no promises to the outcomes of applying wisdom. There's the expectation, and you will realize it to some degree, to a great degree, hopefully, that it works. But God doesn't promise an outcome. And so Solomon is dealing with that, dealing with the aftermath of coming to that realization through his vast exploration of the totality of God's works that include this whole thing of, why did I cut myself? I sharpened my knife. I sharpened my axe. Well, sometimes that just happens. Got to leave it with God. Verses 12 to 15 of chapter 10, the words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but a fool is swallowed by his own lips. So just these verses, in contrast to the wise, the words and ways of the fool are completely unprofitable. So like in Proverbs, we find a healthy dose of, you want to be a fool? Here's what you expect. A fool does this, a fool will experience this. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness. The end of his talk is mischievous madness, and so forth. Verse 12, wise words are gracious or maybe win favor. And so our words have a lot to do with the outcome of life. And of course, Proverbs is full of that, the book of Proverbs. The fool destroys himself with his words or lips. And fool here, the particular word, in Proverbs there are 5 kinds of fool. And one of the words that's primary is used here. This describes a person who is dull or obstinate with a propensity to make wrong choices. Okay, just your average fool. Okay, and they all have that in common. Verse 13, the fool begins poorly and goes downhill from there on. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is mischievous madness. Okay. The more a fool talks, not the better it gets, it's the worse it gets, okay? And so that's a hallmark. Verse 14, also a fool multiplies words. The fool pronounces on things he knows very little about, acting as if he knows what will be. That is, how present events will unfold and what the future holds, what will be after him. I remember being picked up at an airport for a conference I was going to, and the lady who picked me up had her son and 1 or 2 of his friends in the back seat. They were junior high boys. It was interesting to listen to them talk from the airport to wherever we were going. They'd solved every world problem, analyzed everything that they'd seen on the news. Just, they just had it down, you just have to laugh. But that's how we are as human beings, unless we become wise. Unless we come to know what we don't know, and know how what we do know is from God. And that's the whole goal. Here in this last verse, verse 15, the labor of fools wearies every one of them, for he doesn't know how to go to the city. Labor here, and this is one of the few uses of the word labor in this latter part of the book, and it doesn't have to do with the other situation that was being dealt with. Labor is the wearisome laboring of his words in an attempt to produce something intelligible or coherent. Okay? Whereas in reality, he's incapable of successfully carrying on even the simple functions of everyday life, like how to go to the city. He loses his way, and so, speech. And again, just common sense, and you find this kind of a thing very, very commonly in the book of Proverbs. So finally, in verses 16 to 20, which will conclude chapter 10, woe to you, land, when your king is a child, and your princes eat in the morning. Happy are you, land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes eat in due season for strength and not for drunkenness. So this section, 10 verses 16 to 20, is basically saying, regardless of the quality of government, wisdom prohibits the cursing of God's agents. Okay? So, an inexperienced king and other incompetent administrators is who's involved here when your king is a child. The word isn't an age word necessarily. It's more of a novice. Okay, somebody who's old enough to be a king, but doesn't really know anything about being a king. Okay, so a novice, and this word is used in many different contexts in that regard, in that meaning. They indulge in their appetites at inappropriate times. Your king is a novice and your princes eat in the morning. You don't feast in the morning. You go to work in the morning, and if you deserve it, you feast at night. Verse 17, a qualified king, son of nobles, blesses his land through qualified administrators. They satisfy legitimate appetites for the right reasons, for strength, and not selfish motives. Strength here sometimes means military prowess, but it also can relate to wisdom to rule well. And you can look in Proverbs 8. So it says, happy are you, land, when your king is the son of nobles and your princes eat in due season, for strength and not for drunkenness. And then it goes on to talk some more about the fool. By slothfulness the roof sinks in, and through idleness of hands the roof leaks. These are metaphors for the detriment done to a kingdom. The kingdom is weak and open to outside threats. That's what bad leadership does. That's what bad administration does. And so that's what he's getting at here. And then he talks about these defective rulers. They eat merely for merrymaking. They look to wine for gladness rather than to God for true joy in living. Now, wine is used as a symbol of gladness elsewhere in the Bible. And drinking has been a metaphor here for joy. But it's been very clear that the drinking there is drinking as a fearer of God and receiving life as a gift of His. So it's not the wine that's producing the joy. It's God who's producing the joy when the person is drinking their wine as a celebration of the gift of life and in harmony with the giver. So, and then pursue and trust in money is the answer to everything. So it's just, again, contrasting good rulership, good administration as opposed to poor. And it's obvious, it's seen, it's for what it is. And then so finally in verse 20, kings in contrast here. Regardless of the quality of government, wisdom prohibits the cursing of God's agents. This is where we get to that part. Don't curse the king. Good king, bad king. Don't curse the king. Not even in your thoughts. And so we see here that even bad kings and administrators are never to be designated as insignificant and contemptible. That's what the word cursed means. Whether good or bad, the king rules at God's pleasure and as God's servants. And we've seen that in a number of places in this book. You can see it in Exodus 22, Romans 13. God has very clear instructions about what our attitude toward government should be. Not with respect to the character of the governor or the performance of the governor, but the fact that all governors are there ultimately at God's bidding, God's doing. So a bird of the sky may carry your voice. It has a way of becoming known. So just to summarize, just as a person must guard against judging God for his questionable decisions in governing the world, so earthly rulers, whether in the political or economic arenas, must not be cursed as though we really fully understand all that is behind their actions and roles in God's rule of His universe. Let me say this very carefully. In one sense, God miscarries justice more than any ruler who's ever lived on earth. In one sense. And that's what the book's been about, isn't it? God, you're the moral governor of the universe. You're holy. Why do you let this happen? We can't explain that. That's beyond our realm. Now, that does not make God unrighteous. It does not make God wicked. And so I think one way to look at this, if I'm not going to criticize God for the things that He allows to be turned over and overturned, I can probably not criticize the human governor because I don't even know everything that's in that person's. I might change my view if I talk to them. So that kind of a thing is going on here. So again, this whole section, what he's saying is, okay, now I've concluded my quest. I'm not going to find an explanation to compute what God does this and why He allows this and why He doesn't do this. But so I'm going to give some instruction as how do we live? How do we live wisely? And so again, we find Proverbs, proverbial type wisdom here. And, so he's frustrated in his exhaustive efforts to understand God's providential design as it impacts our earthly experience. He concludes that one must still enjoy life as a gift from God, all the while living it responsibly by trusting in the one to whom he must ultimately give an account. And so, again, we have a lot of proverbial instruction here again, but in the context of those problematic things. Proverbs with lemon juice. So that's what most of this last section is about, from chapters 6 and 7, and certainly chapters 8 on. And we'll see how the book ends in the last few sections next week.